Please join me in welcoming Cole Nussbaumer Knaflic, Storytelling with Data for authors at. Cole was on our team, People Analytics and People Operations here at Google many, many years ago, and she led our relationship with sales. And she was known throughout the team for her incredible expertise with presenting data, visualizing data, and making it actually speak to clients and to users. And lots of funny stories about Cole, but one that stands out is her feelings on pie charts. I put together an analysis once that showed a distribution of a specific population by level or something, put it in a beautiful pie chart that I thought was amazing, and Cole gave me very brutally honest feedback about how ineffective it was at actually showing the differences in the group. So Cole, I'm very curious to hear today if you still have those views on pie charts or if maybe they're a little bit more acceptable now.
I still have a pretty strong view when it comes to pie charts.
Okay, well, we look forward to hearing a little bit more about that. So the way that this is gonna work is we're gonna have 30 minutes of a lesson actually from Cole from her book. And then second, we're gonna have Q&A moderated by Tina Malm from People Analytics and me, Davey from People Analytics as well. So please, again, join me in welcoming Cole to her first stop on her book tour here at Google.
Awesome. So it seems so fitting for me for Google to be the first stop after the official publication of my book, since this is where so much of it began. I started at Google back in 2007 on the People Analytics team. And People Analytics is an analytical team in the People Ops organization here, where the goal is to try to ensure that all the decisions about people, employees, future employees, are data-driven. Now, I had the opportunity of joining when the team was relatively small, which meant that I got to work on a ton of cool stuff over the years, learning about things like what makes a manager effective, how do you build productive teams, what drives attrition. Now, in 2010, we developed a program called Basecamp. Was an internal MBA-like training program within People Operations. And I was asked to build content on data visualization, which was an awesome opportunity because I'd always been really interested in this space. But this meant I could pause and research and understand why some of the things I'd arrived at through trial and error over time had been effective. So as a side note, I can honestly say that Google, for me, was life-changing. I didn't know it at the time, but the very first time I delivered the data visualization course, which was at a People Ops offsite in Monterey, in the very first row sat my future husband. So you could really say without the data visualization course here at Google, I wouldn't have these. Or the third, that's on the way. Super life-changing. But back on Google. There was broader interest we were finding in the data visualization course. So we actually ended up rolling it out across Google, which meant I got the opportunity to travel to offices in London and Dublin and Zurich and train trainers and teach courses. Also got a chance to teach courses across a number of US offices, including many right here in Mountain View. One of the things that was interesting for me was to see salespeople and engineers sitting side by side in those courses. Came to realize that the skills needed in this area were fundamental. They weren't specific to any given role. They also weren't specific to Google. Over time, other organizations started reaching out to me, wanting me to go teach their teams and their organizations how to communicate effectively with data. So over the course of the past couple of years, I've had the opportunity to work with hundreds of different teams across many different organizations. And usually this takes the form of workshops, where I'll spend half a day or a full day teaching foundational lessons on communicating with data. And oftentimes what I'll do is solicit examples from the group ahead of time. And we'll go through the lessons, and then we'll spend time talking about that group's specific examples. And I'll go through my makeovers as one potential path that leverages the lessons that we've covered. So I thought it might be cool to take you through a couple of these. We won't go through them in a lot of detail, but just to give you a visual sense of what you can learn in the book. So this first example is one from the philanthropic sector. This was a foundation that wanted to start a conversation on shifting spending from non-initiative, which is the big sort of cream-colored segment at the top left, to higher education, that tiny blue segment. So in this case, we changed from the pie chart, we've already talked about my views there, to this. right? If we want to shift spending, let's say we want to shift spending and start a conversation about that. Use visual cues to draw our audience's attention to where we want them to pay it. Let's look at another example. So this is one from an IT group who couldn't believe that people, after looking at this graph, weren't doing anything with this information. Why weren't they acting upon this information? Here it gets totally lost in the graph, right? There's no story to bring it to life. Now the backstory was, if we stare at this long enough, we can see there's a gap starting to form out on the right-hand side, where the number of tickets coming in are exceeding the number that are being processed. Now the backstory was they'd lost a couple of resources, they were understaffed, and they really wanted to hire a couple more people. And they couldn't understand why nobody was doing that based on this graph. So in this case, we changed from that to this. Again, making that call to action clear, annotating the context directly on the graph, drawing attention to that gap that's forming on the right-hand side. So I got one more of these. This is an example from a small organization who was recognizing that their regional sales composition had shifted over time and wanting to have a conversation about what some of the implications of that were. Now, this is an interesting one. I've used this a number of times in workshops. And when people flip to this graph, there's often a sort of immediate negative visceral reaction, which is something we want to try to avoid in our audiences. And now I can't imagine all of them were Packers fans, like my husband. These are sort of Broncos colors, right? But rather that this graph was unnecessarily confusing. Now, the beautiful thing here is there are some clear takeaways articulated at the bottom. It's just almost impossible to know where to look in the data for evidence of those takeaways. So in this case, changed from that to this, making the focus on the change, tying the text directly to the data, both through proximity and similarity of color. Now, one thing to note is these examples, they cross many different industries. I mentioned before, these skills, they're not role-specific. They're also not really industry-specific. Rather, they're foundational. And over time, through all of the workshops that I've taught over the past few years, I've codified these lessons. And that's what ultimately led to this, my book. And I'm super excited to be able to share with you today a couple quick lessons from my new book, Storytelling with Data. So we're going to talk today about two key lessons. First off, focusing attention, and secondly, telling a story. I want to draw one important distinction at this point, which is the distinction between exploratory analysis and explanatory analysis. So exploratory analysis, you perhaps start off with a question or hypothesis, or you're just digging through your data, trying to understand what's interesting, what can I learn about this data that somebody else might care about. Once you've identified that interesting thing, then we move into explanatory space. That is where you have something specific you want to communicate to somebody specific. And it's this latter space we want to keep in mind today. And when it comes to explanatory analysis, these lessons become more important than perhaps any others. First off, thinking about where you want your audience to pay attention and doing things on purpose to make that happen. And then secondly, never simply showing data, but rather making data a pivotal point in an overarching story. So we'll talk briefly through each of these. First off, focusing attention. I can recall a time at Google where I was working on the Project Oxygen study. Quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with Project Oxygen? Most people in the room. So Project Oxygen was a study led by my colleague Neil Patel. And the goal really was to try to understand on a mathematical, a statistical level, what makes managers effective. One of the challenges that we encountered was, after the study was done, communicating the results of it to a very mixed audience, where we had both engineers who had a great desire for detail. They wanted to understand the methodology, they wanted to be convinced of the robustness of the analysis. At the same time, we were also wanting to communicate to sales managers, for example, who were mostly less concerned with the methodology and more concerned about what's in it for me. How should I act differently based on this? And so what we found was, by really being careful about how we focused attention, we could preserve a lot of that detail, but push it to the background and make the meta point pop out so that it was clear. Let's talk a little bit about how people see to get into more of this how we focus attention. So here's a super simplified picture of that process. On the left-hand side, you have light refracting off a stimulus. This gets captured by our eyes. We don't fully see with our eyes. Rather, most of what we think of as visual processing takes place in our brains. Now, in the brains, there are a few types of memory that are important to understand as we're designing visual communications. We'll talk about one of them today, which is iconic memory. Iconic memory is super short-term. It's shorter than short-term memory, and information stays there for fractions of a second before it gets forwarded onto our short-term memory. The really cool thing about iconic memory is that it's tuned to a specific set of what we call pre-attentive attributes. So let's actually pause here and do a quick exercise. So in a moment, I'm going to put a bunch of numbers up on the screen. What I'd like you all to do, as fast as you can, is count the number of threes that you see. We got it, we're going to count threes. When you know the answer, shout it out. It is a race. You would like to win. Ready, set, go. All right, 6 is the correct answer. This took a bit of time, though, right? You had to physically read through these 4 lines of text, look for 3, which is kind of a complicated shape. Watch what a different exercise it becomes when I make one tiny change. Don't have time to think, don't have time to blink. Suddenly, there are 6 threes in front of you. This is so apparent so quickly because I'm leveraging your iconic memory. I'm using the pre-attentive attribute of intensity of color, in this case, to make the threes the one thing that stand out as different from the rest. Now, this is hugely critical because what this means is our pre-attentive attributes, if we use them strategically, can help enable us to get our audience to see what we want them to see before they even know they're seeing it. Here are the attributes. I won't read through all of these, but notice as your eyes scan across the screen, how they're just drawn to the one within each group that's different from the rest. You don't really have to consciously look for it. Now, one thing to know about the attributes is people tend to associate quantitative values with some, but not others. For example, most people will consider a long line to represent a greater value than a short line. It's one of the reasons bar charts are intuitive for us to read. But we don't think of hue, for example, in the same way. If I ask you which is greater, red or blue, it's not really a meaningful question. And this is important because it tells us which of the attributes can be used to encode quantitative information and which should be used as categorical differentiators. Now, as you can perhaps imagine, pre-attentive attributes become huge tools for focusing our audience's attention when it comes to visualizing data. So here's some sort of generic data from our annual customer survey. We can see how we've fared across a number of dimensions. Notice how, without other visual cues, this becomes very much like the count the threes example again. We have to look at this data, read through it, figure out what might be important to pay attention to. Whereas if I'm the one communicating this data, I should have already done that for you. In which case, I can use some pre-attentive attributes, perhaps paired with some explanatory text, to draw your attention very quickly to one part of the story. Right? Price and convenience, we're doing awesome here. Let's pause and celebrate our success. Or I can use this same broad strategy to draw your attention, totally different place in the data. But we're struggling when it comes to relationship and brand. How can we positively impact these areas? Now, there's a test I like to employ in trying to figure out whether you're using your pre-attentive attributes strategically. And that is the where are your eyes drawn test, where you look away from your visual and look back at it, or close your eyes and look back at it, and just notice where your eyes land first, because it's probably where your audience's eyes will land as well. So I thought we'd do this with a series of pictures and just talk about the implications for our visual designs. So I'm going to put a series of different pictures up there. When I put the picture up, just shout out where your eyes go first. Ready? Where do your eyes go first? Here. Stop sign, right? You almost can't look anywhere else at the onset because it's bright, it's red, it's got these big, bold capital letters. It's outlined in white, which sets it apart from the background. When I think about how you can use some of those cues when you're visualizing data to draw attention as well. Let's do another one. Where do your eyes go? Here. Yeah, if you're like most people, they go to the sun. But if you're like me, when you try to look at the sun, you get this plane sort of tugging on your peripheral vision. Or if I try to look at the plane, I can see the sun sort of wanting to pull me that way. So just be aware that when you're emphasizing multiple things in a graph or on a page, this tension that can be created in your audience. How about, where do your eyes go here? This depends a little bit perhaps on where you're sitting in the room. A lot of people will be drawn to that perennial sale sign in bright pink because it's bright, because of the black bold lettering on it. And then most people from there will continue down and rightward. And that's because without other visual cues, we typically start at the top left of our page or our screen and do zigzagging Z's across. So in this case, that draw to the perennial sale was strong. So we started there and then continued on that Z downward and to the right. Notice that means we missed whatever was happening in the top left quadrant, and maybe that second and third quadrant as well. So to be thoughtful about the overarching designs of the pages on which your data visualization sits and take that into account. Just a couple more of these. Where do your eyes go? Here. Everywhere and nowhere, all at the same time. Right? Colorful is an awesome goal for a birthday party. Color is not such an awesome goal when it comes to visualizing data. When we make so many things different, we have a lot of stuff competing for our attention, which actually makes it really hard to look at any one thing. Check out the difference in how your attention is focused here versus here. Right? With the red balloon, the one thing that's different on the whole page, we almost can't not look at it. That is the power of color, specifically used strategically. Let's take a look now at an example from that Project Oxygen study that I mentioned at the onset. This is what one of our original slides looked like. It's been genericized a bit. We can see our main takeaway at the top. Some elements of job satisfaction are more sensitive to manager quality than others. We've got some categorizations here and then our data at the bottom. Here we're not using color so strategically. Here color is used as a categorical differentiator. Originally we've taken them off here, but we're categories along the bottom. You can think of those like Google Guys categories, things like career development and performance management and culture, which is not necessarily how we want to be using our color. So in this case, our redesign looked like this. The graph's mostly the same. The contents of the page are pretty much exactly the same. We've just rearranged things a bit and used our pre-attentive attributes, color specifically, more thoughtfully to really draw our audience's attention to where we want them to pay it. While we draw attention, we also want to think about embedding our data in story. So by way of a Google anecdote, I can recall a time when I was working with one of the junior analysts on our team. And she had just finished analyzing Google Geist results from the annual employee survey for a given part of the organization, and was getting ready to communicate those results to the leader of that team. And this particular team had been struggling in a lot of places. The scores weren't great, so there was some sensitivity around how that message should be delivered. And the deck at that point was page after page after page of the standard report. No story and little narrative to tie it all together. It would have been very easy for the leader of that group to say, oh, that's interesting, and move on to the next thing. That would have been a failure. So what I had the analyst do was set the deck aside and tell me the story. Tell me what you learned when you were analyzing this data. And when we did that, the articulation of the story was super powerful. There were clear areas for improvement, and she knew exactly where to focus action to achieve that improvement. This we could use to light a fire under the leader for that team. So it's a good example of how data without story isn't always so meaningful, but the story can help bring the data to life. So when I think about how we can leverage that power when we are communicating with data every time we're doing it. Here are some facts on a slide. Go ahead and read through these. Anybody recognize what we're looking at here? What story is this? Red Riding Hood, right? But facts on a slide are not so compelling or memorable. If I ask you a day or two from now, what distance was it from Red Riding Hood's house to Grandma's? Or what time did Red Riding Hood get there? These aren't likely facts that you will have committed to your memory. Stories, on the other hand, are memorable. So how many people, quick show of hands, know the story of Red Riding Hood? Pretty much everybody in the room. We'll do a quick thought exercise here. We'll just take about 15 seconds. Close your eyes or stare up at this screen, and I'd like you to recall for yourself the story of Red Riding Hood, thinking specifically about the plot, the twists, and the ending. 15 seconds here. Quick show of hands, how many people were able to get to the high-level story? People are always a little afraid to raise their hands at this point for fear of what might happen next. Bear with me, I'll tell you the story that resides in my head. So Red Riding Hood sets off, she has a basket of goodies. She's going to Grandma's. Grandma's not feeling well. And on her way, she encounters a wolf. The wolf is able to extract from her where she's going and realizes that if he's patient, he can have not only one dinner, but two. So he races ahead to Grandma's, eats Grandma, and dresses up in her clothes, gets into her bed. Red Riding Hood arrives and senses something is awry and goes through a series of questioning with the wolf posing as Grandma. Oh, Grandma, how big your eyes are. Oh, Grandma, how big your ears are. Oh, Grandma, how big your teeth are. To which the wolf replies, all the better to eat you with. So Wolf actually eats Red Riding Hood as well, but then Guy with an axe shows up, cuts open the wolf's belly, and the wolf had eaten Grandma and Red in such haste that they're fine. They come out. And interestingly, if you go back to the Grimm's original, the wolf doesn't die then. They actually fill his stomach with rocks and sew him up so that when he wakes up, he drops dead. I think it's a warning story in, go straight where you're intended to go, don't talk to strangers, and so forth. But what does this tell us about what we're here to talk about today? So for me, stories like Red Riding Hood are evidence of a couple of things. First off is the power of repetition. When you consider it's probably been some amount of time since you've given much thought to the story of Red Riding Hood. And yet, over the course of time, you've perhaps heard that story a number of times, read the story a number of times, maybe told the story a number of times. There's something that happens with that repetition of use, of hearing and saying and reading things multiple times that helps form a bridge from our short-term memory to our long-term memory. The other cool thing that stories like Red Riding Hood illustrate for us is this magical combination of plot and twists and ending that enable things to stick with us in a way that we can later recall and retell to somebody else. So when I think about how we can leverage these powerful concepts when it comes to the stories that we want to tell with our data, to get those to be something our audience will remember in a way that they can later recall and retell to somebody else. So when we think about the components of the story, I want to think back to those same things that we talked about with Red Riding Hood. The plot, the twists, the ending. The plot becomes what context is essential for your audience. What do they need to know in order to be in the right frame of mind for what you're going to tell them? Then the twists. What's interesting about the data and what it shows? By the way, if there isn't anything interesting about the data, don't show the data. You run the risk of losing your audience's attention for when you do have something important to say with it. And then finally, the ending, the call to action. What do you want your audience to do? My view is we should always want our audience to do something, and we should be working to make that something as clear as possible. Because if we simply show data, as we saw in that case with the Google Guys stack, it's easy for our audience to say, oh, that's interesting, and move on to the next thing. But if we ask for action, our audience has to respond to that. And even if they disagree, it starts a conversation. And it's a conversation that may never happen if we simply show data. Let's take a look at an example. So in this scenario, imagine that you just wrapped up a summer learning program on science. The goal was to get kids excited about science. We have some survey data from a survey we gave before the program on the left and after the program on the right, where children could classify their interest as bored, not great, okay, kind of interested, and excited. I'll give you a moment to take this in, and then we'll talk about it. How's it feel comparing segments across two pies? Not so great, right? The only thing worse than a pie, for me personally, two pies. especially when you're trying to compare across them, because if anything changed in the data, which it should have if there's something interesting you're trying to say, the pieces are all in an entirely different place over there on the right. So you always want to think about, what do you want to allow your audience to compare? How do you align those things to a common baseline and put them as close together as possible? But check out what happens if I talk you through the narrative. So going into the program, the biggest segment of students, this 40% in green, felt just okay about science. Maybe hadn't made up their minds one way or the other. Whereas after the program, a really cool thing happened. That great big 40% shrunk down to only 14%. Now, there was a little bit of movement in the negative direction. Bored and not great went up a percentage point each. But most of the movement was in the positive direction, wherein after the program, nearly 70% of kids, if we add together that purple and teal segments, expressed interest towards science. This is a successful program. We should continue to offer it. Notice how, with a strong narrative, I can actually get away with a kind of crummy visual. The alternative does not hold true. I can have the most beautiful data visualization in the world, and without a compelling story to go with it, to make my audience care about it, to make it something that resonates with them, that sticks with them, I run the risk of that beautiful data visualization falling flat. So it's not to say we shouldn't spend time perfecting our data visualization, but rather to underscore the importance of story. And now nirvana in this stuff is reached when both are strong. You have a powerful story and an effective visual to back it up. So in this case, we could end up somewhere like this. Exposure to science excites kids. Bit of background, our call to action, let's keep offering this. Then we get down to the data. How do you feel about science? Beforehand, most kids tied through both color and proximity to the data point that is evidence of that point. Most kids felt okay. Whereas after the program, we get this pull to the right-hand side where kids are feeling interested, they're feeling excited about science. That's the kind of story that we want to create for our audience. That's the way we want to be able to focus attention for our audience. So those are the quick lessons I have to cover here with you today. I wanted to give you a quick sense of how they fit in with the rest of the content in the book. So I've listed out the chapters here. Chapter 1 starts off with a lesson on context, having a really clear understanding of who your audience is and what you want them to know or do before you really spend a lot of time creating visuals or content. In chapter 2, I talk about different types of common displays used to communicate business analytics and go through some use cases and examples of each. The third chapter is all about clutter, getting comfortable identifying the stuff that's there that isn't adding information to our visuals and stripping those unnecessary elements away. Fourth chapter is on focusing attention. What we looked at today is just a small subset of much broader content that's covered there. Fifth lesson is on thinking like a designer. Talk about how you can leverage some concepts of traditional design, things like affordances and accessibility and building acceptance with your audience when it comes to visualizing data. Chapter 6, we look at a number of what I'd consider model visuals, and I talk about the design thought process used to create those. Chapter 7 is focused on story. And again, what we've looked at today is just a small piece of that. Chapter 8 pulls all of these lessons together, goes through a single example from start to finish, showing all of these in coordination. Chapter 9 covers a number of case studies on common challenges faced when visualizing data. And then the final chapter is a wrap-up. Recap what's learned, talk about where to go next, and discuss building a storytelling with data competency in your team and in your organization. So before I turn this over to Q&A, I wanted to say a quick word on Google. So when I joined Google in 2007, I was the envy of all my friends. And one thing that's been really cool to see, as I've talked to so many people at so many different organizations, is this fascination with Google still exists today. So one word of advice from a former Googler to current Googlers is to really just appreciate everything that Google has to offer. Take full advantage of all of the opportunities that you have here. I like to think that I did, and it got me to a really fantastic place. So with that, I say a very big thank you.
Cole, thank you so much. This was so fantastic. I've been exposed to your ideas for such a long time now. since 2009 or since 2010, I attended your trainings. Can I not put my feet up there? No. I attended your trainings and I read your book and I just listened to this fantastic introduction to your book, and I still learn something new and something different sticks with me every time. It's like one of those good movies that you keep watching over and over again. So we want to open up the next 30 minutes with Q&A. So I have the microphone, so I'm going to be walking throughout the room to see if there are any questions in the room. If you have any questions for Cole and VC, please email Daniel, KUY, at. I did already receive one question while you were talking, and it is not about the book, but the question is from San Francisco. So the question was, what is life outside of Google?
Oh, life outside of Google. So it's rough, right? You have to do things like make your food yourself, go to the grocery store. No, life outside of Google is good, but it's sad a little at the same time. I think what I miss most about working at Google, hands down, were the fantastic colleagues who I had sort of right there when I was working here. And when you're working on your own, you miss that sort of sense of camaraderie that you get when you have a team around you. So I work with other people, but it's always sort of a person here or a person there. There's not the same sort of energy that you get by being in an office on a daily basis with the people with whom you work. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you venture to the outside, if you're going out on your own.
What inspired you to actually write a book? You've been given so many workshops.
Yeah, great question. So I think for me, it was about being able to bring some of these lessons to a broader audience. I love teaching on this. I get really excited about it, and I like to see the excitement that sort of builds in other people. But I can only teach so many people. You know, it's just me. So being able to write that book means it can sort of be out there for anybody to pick up, and especially for people who may not otherwise have an opportunity to go to one of the workshops. It's nice to be able to put the lessons out there.
Hey, Cole. My question is about interactive visuals. I would guess that in 2008 or 9 when you were starting, mostly visualization meant a static thing on a piece of paper. And now, like New York Times interactive visuals, D3, there's so much interactive. I'm curious about how you think about interactive visuals in general, and particularly when you think they're most appropriate, or any lessons about interactive visuals?
Yeah, great question, David. So I tend to focus in the examples that we saw here and in the book on static visuals. When you have a specific story you're trying to tell, how do you get that across your audience in a way that's going to be effective? That said, there's also certainly a place for interactive visuals. One thing I would caution with interactive visuals is just questioning that assumption that your audience wants to dig. I think sometimes we think our audience wants to dig more than they do, or sometimes they even tell us they want to dig more than they may actually do. And so one way I've seen done of marrying the two is to have that meta story and to call that out and to highlight it and to put it in words, but then also allow that interactivity for the audience who's going to be inclined to dig to be able to do that. And the New York Times is a great example of that, right? Because they'll have a couple headlines that they pull out of, here are some of the meta interesting points. Are you looking to rent or to buy, or some of these different interactive visuals that they've put out over the years. But then they also have all of the data there for you to be able to play around with as well, which can create a different sort of engagement with the audience as well, which is one of the really powerful things about interactive visualizations. Yeah, great question.
Hey, Cole.
Hi.
So kind of building off of David's question, I think another common way that people look at data that's different from or I guess it's a little more interactive, but different from a static, is dashboards. So we create these big dashboards, and sometimes they're useful, sometimes they're not, but they have a lot of data there. And how do you think about it when it's I guess, a little bit more challenging because you don't necessarily know ahead of time what the story is going to be? And so how do you still capture that story aspect when you just don't know what it will end up being?
Yeah, dashboards are sort of a specific different use case as well. And when it comes to dashboards, if you really are wanting to allow your audience to dig and come up with their own stories, then you actually want to stay away from some of the stuff that we talked about here today. Because as soon as you use color, especially, to draw your audience's attention to one story, it actually makes any other potential stories much harder to see. So dashboards, you want to think about designing in grays when you can, or using color only as a categorical differentiator, not as a visual cue that says draw attention here. Dashboards for me fit, I talked about this distinction between exploratory and explanatory. And for me, dashboards fit more in the exploratory, but I think often get sort of tried to be used for the explanatory, where a dashboard is sort of, I've got all of these metrics on a single page or on a single screen. I can scan through them. I can look for where are things in line with what I expect, where are they not in line with what I expect, and then pick out, hey, something might be interesting there, and then dig in on that. And when you can find the interesting thing, then instead of using the dashboard to communicate that, my view is you should do the stuff we talked about today and take that interesting thing and make that the focus, and not necessarily confine yourself to the dashboard for that. Because the challenge is in trying to communicate to an audience with a dashboard is by showing them so much, it's hard to draw attention to one particular place.
First of all, thanks for such a compelling presentation. It was incredible.
Awesome, thank you.
My question is, in addition to reading your book, what are some resources that you could recommend for us to explore data and kind of create those effective presentations? And like on the flip side, like what are your favorite tools? Like do you use like Tableau or Sheets, of course?
Yeah.
Excel, yeah. Thanks.
Great question. So yeah, when it comes to getting inspiration for visualizing data, there's a massive amount of content out there on the web. Right? You Google it and you'll come up with some great things. Some really fantastic blogs, a lot of great work. There's also a lot of not great work. And so you sort of want to have a lens on of what is effective, why is it effective, but then also when do you see things that aren't effective? And right, just because it's put out by a recognized publication doesn't necessarily mean that, that they're visualizing data well. But some sources of consistently good work, places like, we talked about the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Geographic does some really great data visualizations. When it comes to tools in particular, everything we looked at today was Excel, which is what I find myself using primarily because it's what most of my clients use. Tableau is certainly increasingly popular. My view is you should find a tool, pick a tool, and get to know it as best you can so that it doesn't become a limiting factor in applying some of the things that we talked about today. So any tool can be used well, and any tool can be used poorly. And the cool things about the lessons we went through today and the lessons in the book is they're not specific to any given tool. They're tool agnostic. They're foundational principles that you can apply in varying extent in any tool.
I had a question just around what you have seen, or if you've seen, any particular learnings as regards to localization, or when you talked about iconography towards the beginning of your presentation, I know that's so different that we see in street signs depending on what country you're in. Curious if you've seen that at all with the data visualization side of things, including maybe with color.
Yeah, and color is the place that comes to my mind immediately with that question, because one thing to be aware of, color in particular has this unique ability to impart tone and sort of incite emotions, and so you always want to think about how you're using color and what sort of tone you want to set, whether it's in a graph or in the broader communication that contains that graph, and use color to reinforce that. But on that note, one thing to keep in mind is that different cultures associate different meanings with different colors. So depending on who your audience is, who you're communicating to, that's something to take into account. David McCandless has its beautiful sort of visualization that's at the same time interesting tool for visualizing data, which is, it's called Colors in Culture. And it's this big color wheel, and colors in that case is British, he's British, C-O-L-O-U-R-S. But it shows you the connotations that different colors have in different cultures. So it can be a very useful tool if you are communicating to an international audience. His site is informationisbeautiful.net. Great question.
My question is, if we have a lot of data that we want to show, like there are lots of key insights that we want to pull, would you suggest that we try to parse them out into different pieces, or do you have a recommendation for something that we could use to kind of point out all the different insights?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. So one thought is when you have a lot of different things you want to say about the same data set is to step back and figure out, is there an overarching story that you can use to weave all of those disparate pieces together? Because as we talked about, that's one way of really making it memorable for your audience. A specific strategy you can use depending on the situation is something similar to what we looked at with that generic bar graph from the customer survey, where if if you're showing a bunch of data and you want to be able to talk your audience through it, but then focus on one specific thing at a time, you can start off with just the data, or even just a blank graph sometimes that has the axes labeled and titled, but no actual data. Explain to your audience what they're going to be looking at. Then you layer on the data, and then you maybe use color or another visual cue to draw your audience's attention to one part and talk about that. Then draw attention to another part and then talk about that. Is a nice way of being able to build familiarity with the data with your audience as you talk through it, and then also focus attention really specifically within that broader data set when you have specific things you want to say about it. Great question.
Then let me ask you one more. Your opinions about green. I noticed that you didn't use any green on the slide.
Oh, interesting point. So that was by accident, probably more than intentional. Although back on the topic of color, one thing you want to be sensitive to is color blindness. So roughly 8% of men and 0.5% of women experience some form of color blindness. Most typically that manifests itself as difficulty in distinguishing between shades of red and shades of green, which means you want to, in general, avoid using shades of red and shades of green together. Or if you want to leverage that connotation, right? Green, it went up, that's good. Red, it went down, that's bad. You can do so. Just make sure you have some additional visual cues there. Make the numbers also bold. Put the plus or minus sign in front of them. Do something else to set them apart visually so you're not inadvertently disenfranchising part of your audience. Personally, I tend to do my designs mostly in gray and then use blue really sparingly to draw attention. I like blue because you avoid the colorblind issues. It also prints well in black and white if that's a concern. But that said, blue is certainly not your only option. And you want to think about, as we talked about, the tones of different colors. You want to think about brand colors and all of these things and how those can fold into how you visualize your data.
Cole, I just want to point out that even though you haven't been at Google for a number of years, you're still super influential, and I see a lot of great slides that are blue, that are gray, and I, for one, have a delight in cutting all the clutter, and I think it's because of you, so thank you so much for your contributions.
Awesome.
One question that we had for you, we've talked a lot about the what in the book.
Yes.
I'm also curious about the how. What was the most difficult part of writing this book? I mean, was it a bigger challenge that you had predicted? Like, what was super difficult about it?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So I tend to be very organized and very structured. So once I decided I was going to do this, I set out and I made the plan of here's what each chapter is going to be, here's the timeline, set some sort of aggressive timelines with my publisher. So I think really the hardest part was time. Right? Because actually physically writing and creating all of the visuals takes a lot of time. As you saw, there are a couple of small people who live at my house, and so time is precious. So trying to fit it in between all of life's other things was challenging at times, but I think overall worked out really well.
What's one thing you see people doing consistently wrong? If there's one message you want the audience to take away, what would it be?
Well, I'm going to parlay that into two things because I can do that. So we've talked about color a bit, but the lowest hanging fruit typically when I'm working with different organizations is being thoughtful in their use of color. I think when it comes to communicating with data, you never want to use color to make something colorful, but rather color, when used sparingly and strategically, can be one of your most powerful tools for drawing your audience's attention to where you want them to pay it. So being intentional in your use of color would be one big tip. The other, and we talked about this, would be to never just show data. Always have a story and articulate that story in words, either through your voiceover or, if it's on a slide or on a graph, through physical text on that graph, so that your audience isn't left guessing what they're meant to get out of it, but rather you've put that work there for them.
Cole, you gave us a preview on focusing attention and telling a story, but I'm curious of the other 8 chapters, of all the 10 in the book, what was your favorite and why?
Interesting question. I think for me, my favorite was actually the chapter on storytelling, because for me, that was the one that it was harder than the others. The book goes much more in depth on storytelling than I've historically gone in the workshops. So for some of the chapters, they were pretty easy to write because it was mostly just writing the words that I say in the workshops. But the storytelling chapter was not like that at all. I paused and I did a lot of research and I tried to organize it one way and then realized that wasn't working, tried to organize it another way. So it was a lot of going back to the drawing board and trying to figure out how do the pieces fit together? How can I weave it together in a way that's going to be compelling for people people reading it and be understandable for people reading it. But I'm really happy with how that one turned out. So I think that's probably my favorite chapter.
Your target audience, who do you think your target audience is?
It's really anybody who has a need to communicate with data. So whether that's working with data on a daily basis or less frequently. And the concepts that we talk about, or that I talk about in the book, the examples are specific to data for the most part, but really it's any time you need to communicate visually to an audience. And a lot of it goes back to really thinking about who your audience is and how you want them to use the information that you're putting in front of them, and then just designing thoughtfully with that in mind.
Cole, one question that kind of came up in the audience is like, what are other resources that are available? What are other experts out there? So I'm expanding on that question. Somebody like an Edward Tufte, do you talk to people that are like known for being data visualization experts? And I'm really curious to hear, like, do you disagree with them on anything, or have you like ever had like a data viz like battle it out or something?
Great question. And actually, we'll come back to pie charts on this question. Yeah, absolutely. Data viz it's a really fun community. It's relatively close knit. Sort of the main players all sort of know each other or know of each other, and we have some correspondence. And one of the things that's really cool is that there's really a lot of open sharing, right? Because the goal is to make everybody better, everybody more effective at this stuff. But one particular disagreement, so Robert Kosara is one of the main data visualization researcher guys at Tableau. And he was actually one of the reviewers on my book. And he disagrees that pie charts are inherently evil. And so he and I have had some decent debate on this. My view is relatively strong that pie charts, you can say some general things, right? This segment's big, this segment's small, but you can't really say like how much bigger, how much smaller, answer some of the more specific questions. Whereas his view is a pie chart absolutely has its place. It is the most effective visual for communicating part of a whole. But people often misuse them and use them to try to do other things outside of that. So his view is rather than banish them completely, let's teach people how to use them smartly. I disagree, but we've agreed to disagree, and we're on good terms.
That's awesome.
Cole, you've conducted so many workshops on this topic. Have you noticed any differences between people attending these workshops, between various industries, people from the tech sector versus academics versus people from the banking industry?
Yeah, I think there are absolutely differences when it comes to just culturally, how do different organizations deal with data, communicate with data. But one thing that's been cool to see is that these lessons, they stay the same, irrespective of industry. They sort of cut across all industries, which is interesting. And for me, being able to see the organization's data and see some of how they've communicated with data before going in gives me such an interesting perspective and lens on the organization. But so I think there are differences in how organizations use data, but the concepts that we talk about in the book really span everything.
Cole, one question. You mentioned that like you did a lot of research for the book. You mentioned some like I'm guessing neuroscience type concepts. What sort of disciplines did you draw on? When you were like researching or composing, or as you've become more and more of an expert?
Yeah, one of the interdisciplinary places that I've drawn a lot of inspiration from is just the area of physical design. When you think about if you're designing a chair, how do you make that work for your audience? And now data is different because it's not a sort of a tangible thing. So the things you have at your disposal to show how to use something is not tangible, it's visual. So then it's thinking about how do you visualize this, how do people see, bringing in some of those sorts of things. One example that I like, are people familiar with the OXO brand of kitchen gadgets? So they're things like vegetable peelers or spatulas or like a garlic press. And if you just sort of spew them or lay them out on a counter, it's intuitive how to pick them up. And you sort of don't even realize that when you're picking them up, because they're formed in the way that's going to make you pick them up in the way they're intended to be used, which is brilliant, right, from a design standpoint. And we want to think about how we can leverage those same sort of cues when it comes to our data, of how do you make it so obvious to the audience how they're supposed to use that data that they can't use it any other way, right, that they can't help but see what you want them to see. So design is probably one of the big places that I drew from when it came to researching some of the stuff for the book.
In regards to tools, earlier you mentioned Excel and PowerPoint, but are there any other tools I need to be fluent in to apply your lessons?
No, and not necessarily be Excel and PowerPoint either. We talked about Tableau, Sheets. There are many different tools out there. And again, my view is that any tool can be used well and any tool can be used not so well. But pick a tool, get to know it as best you can so that it doesn't become a limiting factor when it comes to applying some of the lessons that we've talked about and some of the lessons covered in the book.
Cole, if you were to do storytelling with data V2 in 10 years or 20 years, I know it takes a lot of time to write these books, what would it be on? Like, would anything change dramatically, or what do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I used to always get that question at Google as well of like, what's data visualization 201? When's that coming? What does that look like? And for me, there isn't an obvious sort of next one because the concepts that we talk about, they're fundamental. They should be used always, and as you get more experience visualizing data, it's not that the way you visualize it changes. I think it just becomes more nuanced in how you apply some of the things that we talk about here. So for me, there isn't an obvious sort of next iteration, but who knows, that may change after the next 100 workshops or so.
Hi, Cole. I teach a wonderful course of data visualization here at Google, and today, so I teach Data Viz 1, which is pretty much focused on the first part of your presentation today. I really loved it with the second part of your presentation with the storytelling. I think it made perfect sense, and I think a lot of us could benefit from learning these two things together because storytelling is obviously such an important part of the overall lesson here. So is this something that we can steal with pride? And I used to work with the people dev team, so I would love to share anything that's available. And I just think a lot of Googlers will benefit with the second part of this presentation today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely check out the book because, like I said, storytelling is covered in much more depth there. Because the storytelling piece really came in after the original course here was developed. So there's not a lot of that content there. But yeah, I mean, this is a space where when you see something good or effective, steal it. Use it for your own use. There's no shame in that at all. And it's by practicing these sorts of things that we all get better. So yeah, absolutely.
Cole, it is so great to see you back at Google as someone who took the very early version of the course and I knew this is something special which I wish somebody in the rest of the world gets to see, and I know how passionate you are about this topic. I'm so happy to see this coming. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us. My question was around, this is just as much from the organizational perspective. It's a skill, but it's also like the culture of just having so much focus on it. So as you speak with clients from a variety of industries, what are the type of thing that you think like we as sort of employees or the leaders can do to kind of like get a culture of having focus on this aspect just as much as anything else like data infrastructure or anything else? What can we do to get this message out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, so Google's already taking steps, right? The fact that there is a data viz course here and that it's made widely available sort of proves that there is an appetite for this and resources for it, which is awesome. I think when it comes to propelling that even further and embedding it throughout the culture, it's about recognizing when it's done well and promoting that, right? When it's done well, when there are good examples of really highlighting those to other people and making it a goal. It's always been interesting to me because if you think of the entire analytical process, you start off with a question or hypothesis, then you collect the data, then you clean the data, then you analyze the data, and at that point you can get away with just throwing it in a graph and being done. Where the graph is the only part of that entire process that your audience ever sees. So my view has always been it deserves at least as much time and attention as the other parts. So I think as you have more examples internally of people doing that well, that you can sort of hold up and say, here, this is what we should emulate, it starts building a culture around that over time. And investing in people when it comes to the training, developing internal experts to whom others can turn, all of these things can help sort of continue that positive momentum.
And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you.